It was 10 minutes past 11 on the clock. A thick black smoke was rising over the kingdom. The naked eye could see that there was a fire in the kingdom. In the kitchen, the girl was preparing a culinary delicacy. She was kneading the dough, kneading it in her hands. The kazan was boiling food and bubbling. The girl hummed her favorite song, sha-la-la-la-la. She threw the molded pieces of dough into the cauldron. When they fell, they made an interesting sound. Spit. Vegetables were already cooking in the cauldron. The carrots were carved with flowers. There were several men coming up the stairs quickly. They stomped their feet loudly. The girl was adding some kind of liquid to the cauldron. Knights were coming up the wooden stairs. They wore metal helmets and protective suits. They had swords in their hands. The girl took her time pouring the liquid from the cauldron into a wooden spoon. She blew a little on the contents and tasted it. Suddenly, the voice of one of the men sounded. He opened the door wide and shouted that the princess was here. The princess was standing there tasting her dish. She was trying to figure out what was missing from the dish. What else could she add to make her dish exquisite and very tasty? The girl said she was the princess. She asked the knights to wait a minute because she was still eating, and she quickly began to spoon up the food. One man without a helmet asked, was the sixth princess of Luan really in front of him? And he pointed his finger at the princess. The knights stood around the young man, kept dancing and singing the sha-la-la-la-la song. Her apron was dirty. She was so absorbed in the cooking process that she didn't care about her appearance. Sometimes she would wipe her hands on her apron. The girl looked the young man straight in the eye and nodded approvingly. Yes, she was the sixth princess. The girl continued to eat her dish, scooping it up with a wooden spoon. The young man ordered to grab her. The knights ran up and quickly grabbed the girl under both arms. The bowl of food fell to the floor. The princess was in surprise. Her sujebi had spilled over. She didn't even have time to finish it. The girl tried to shout that she hadn't finished it yet, but the knights lifted her under their arms and carried her to the door. The bowl of spilled sujebi was lying on the floor. Near the kingdom, people gathered. They stood bowing their heads. In front of them, near the kingdom, stood a man. He had a black robe and a crimson cloak. Everyone bowed their heads, including the king, queen, and princesses. Only one of the princesses did not bow her head. Through the crowd of people, the sixth princess, Luana, was making her way through. She apologized and apologized for the inconvenience. She asked to be allowed to pass and to stand aside. Another second, and she ran up to her family king, queen, and princess. She breathed a sigh of relief and tilted her head as well. At that time, someone called out to her. The girl looked up in surprise. She had very beautiful blue eyes. One of the princesses said that this seat was for members of the royal family. The slightest mistake could cost lives, so she asked the girl to sit somewhere else. She was approached by the first princess, Ingrid. The girl resented why she couldn't be where the royal family members belong. She is also one of the members of the royal family. The girls pretended as if they had completely forgotten about her. The princesses were in charming, exquisite outfits. The girl who came in looked different. Her apron was a little dirty. A girl said there was a rumor that a child lived in an abandoned palace, and she thought for a moment. At this time, the royal family members and the common people knelt down. The girl who had just joined the royal family also sat down obediently. From the back of the crowd could be heard crying out, "Poor thing." People started making fun of her. You could laugh all you wanted, they'd all be beheaded here anyway. She knew the fate of the kingdom because she had been reborn with memories from her past life. Before her death, she was reading a popular fantasy novel. The girl read almost always before going to bed. The main character in it was the beautiful Princess Ingrid. She had a gorgeous dress, and long blonde hair that glowed gold in the sun. And the hero of the novella was a mad emperor who dreamed of conquering the continent. The hero wants to get the imperial palace, but the girl refuses. After that, the offended ruler orders the duke to seize the kingdom. This turns into a real drama for the second male protagonist. He falls in love with a princess who is the woman of his master. And the girl is a princess who wasn't even introduced in the novel. She was reborn and became Luana, a child born of the liaison between the maid and the king, as it is unlikely that a life imprisonment in an abandoned palace could have been avoided. The girl liked to dress neatly. Her favorite item of clothing was an apron. It was always fresh white and ironed. Since there was no way to avoid a lifetime imprisonment, the girl decided to enjoy every minute she lived. She was very fond of making flour products. Flour at that time was stored in small, thick sacks tied at the top with thread. The flour was of the highest grade. The girl decided that until her last breath she would eat what she wanted, and when she wanted. With this thought, she kneaded the dough on the wooden board with her hands. The dough was fluffy and elastic. Already the girl kneaded the dough and raised her hands. It would be perfect to have a good meal before she died. In front of the kingdom, a man came out with loud stomping feet. In front of him, all the courtiers knelt down. Only the knights, who stood a little to the side, did not do so. The girl was upset that she couldn't finish the court pancake because she was captured by the knights. A question was asked whether everyone had been brought to the square. Someone answered that yes, everyone had been brought to the square. The girl sat and looked at the young man in surprise. This young man was the general of the enemy army Duke Legion. He was young and very handsome. His black hair fell carelessly over his face. He was dressed perfectly. The king and queen sat on their knees and lowered their heads lower and lower before the duke. The duke was powerful. The girl sat and watched what looked to be his chocolate-colored uniform. It looked delicious. Since the girl liked cooking very much, she associated everything with food. The red-haired princess was very scared. She wrapped her arms around herself. Tears were running down her cheeks. She really didn't want to die. Luana watched and remembered what the Legion's nickname was. The girl acted calm and wasn't scared at all. It felt like she just wasn't afraid of death. The girl remembered and remembered. Perhaps he was called the Emperor's dog or the Emperor's sword. Well, that was more of an insult than a nickname. Why this duke was given such a nickname? Princess Ingrid asked the duke a question. What are they going to do with them? The duke replied, didn't she know what was happening to the ruling family of the captured kingdom? Was it really so hard to guess? The king asked to be spared. He was ready to give him anything he wanted. There were shouts from the crowd. Everyone was afraid for themselves and for the members of the kingdom. Luann was outraged that the king was going to give if the kingdom had fallen. It is no longer possible to give anything to anyone here. The duke looked intently into Luann's eyes, and their gazes met. At this time, the duke started walking towards the princess. The girl began to panic. What's wrong? Why is he heading this way? What does he want to do? The duke stepped closer and stood directly in front of Luann. He pointed his finger at her. The girl was outraged. After all, she had done absolutely nothing. Luann was stepped in by Ingrid. She asked what he was going to do to her. She, too, is a member of the royal family and asked him to leave her alone. Luana was grateful to her sister, but she doesn't even know her name and she's so desperate to protect her. The duke asked the question, who else cares what becomes of this woman? Ingrid said she was still a child and offered to take her instead. The duke froze for a moment. He had not expected Ingrid to be so brave. It was a noble act on the girl's part. And here's the scene. The duke is standing opposite Ingrid. The girl is sitting on her knees in a sumptuous dress. One hand is raised to her chest. She looks proudly into the duke's eyes and tries to protect the girl. It was the very moment when the duke's interest in Ingrid began to dawn on him. He looked into her eyes and drowned in them. This is where the heartbreaking love of the second male character begins. It was just like in the novel. It was cool, and the girl extended 2 thumbs up to the duke. The duke stood looking questioningly at the girl. He did not understand what the gesture meant. His hands were clenched into a fist and his thumbs pointed upwards. He turned to the girl. It was a very unusual gesture. The duke asked what it meant. The girl at that time hid her hands behind her back. She dropped to the floor and said, "This gesture means that the duke is magnificent." Said only a hand would suffice. Now the girl didn't know what he was talking about. The duke suspected she was trying to do something and asked her to show him her hands. The girl said she hadn't meant to do anything like that. It was just that a mosquito had bitten her hand and she wanted to scratch it. The duke did not understand a word of what she said. He asked to search her. The knights crowded round the girl. They surrounded her in a circle and were ready to search her. But the girl hid her hands behind her back and shrank back. At this time, the knights directed their hands towards the girl. They started to do a search. The girl at that started ringing with laughter. She was very, very ticklish. At that time, one of the knights shouted out that he must have found what he needed to find. The girl sat up high with her arms raised. Knight found a meat stick with cheese flecks. He demanded that the girl tell him what it was. The girl quickly thought about what to say. If she was caught, she would probably die. The knights were sure it was some kind of weapon or poison. They asked the girl to tell them immediately what it was. The girl screamed and said it was not a weapon. She was in a lot of pain. If things continue at this rate, she will die before her time. The knights were sure that it was the poison that the girl was hiding. One of the knights tried to pull his sword out of its sheath, but it wasn't poison at all, and the girl confirmed it. She looked at the Duke carefully and covered one eye. Duke Legion said that if the girl told the truth, she would die quickly and painlessly, so the Duke put his sword to her neck. It was almost mirror-like. Looking at the sword, girl saw her reflection. It was as expected. Either way, the girl was destined to die. The only question was whether it was long and painful or quick and easy. The girl's eyes reflected the silhouette of the Duke of the Legion. The girl lowered her eyes to the floor and said, "It's just jerky. It's not poison at all. It's a very tasty product." Duke Legion was surprised. He didn't expect the girl to hide jerky. He asked again to repeat what the girl had said. The girl was visibly nervous. She was rubbing her apron. She thought the Duke was a bit confused. She said clearly and precisely that it was jerky. But the Duke did not understand a word of what she was muttering, so once more he asked her to speak. The girl shouted loudly that it was only jerky and cheese. Everyone was surprised. What's a girl's jerky and cheese doing in her pocket? The princesses were also surprised. Did this girl really have jerky and cheese? The girl blushed with shame. She was ashamed that the search had found dried meat and cheese. The Duke looked questioningly at the girl once more. He wanted to make sure he had heard everything correctly and accurately. He kept his hand on his sword, which he had almost put back in its scabbard. He repeated once more whether he had heard correctly, that he wasn't confused. The Duke of Legion was rushed by two men. They repeated to him what the girl had said. It was jerky and cheese. The second young man similarly repeated what the girl had found. This is jerky and cheese. Ingrid still continued to cover the girl with herself. The girl confirmed that she had some jerky and cheese in her pocket. She had cooked it herself recently. After all, cooking. The princesses and the queen were stunned. She dared to eat meat secretly in such a situation. Ingrid thought the girl was not smart enough, as she had been abandoned since childhood. But still, the girl remained a good child. The girl was surprised. No one had said you couldn't eat meat. At this time, the girl bypassed Princess Ingrid and went straight for the Duke. The Duke once again held her sword in front of her. The men behind her were wondering what she was going to do. The girl walked up to the Duke and handed him a dried piece with cheese. She said she was willing to share this tidbit with the Duke. The girl stood right in front of the Duke and held the piece in her hands. It would be very nice if this meat was to the Duke's liking. The young man reached out his hand to take it. The Duke's hand was gloved. He reached out and took a piece of dried meat from the girl's hand. The men in the back protested. They asked me not to eat it under any circumstances. It was likely to contain poison. The Duke brought a piece of real meat up to his mouth and took a bite of the piece. The girl was very reluctant to settle this situation. Well, it didn't work out as expected. The girl was immediately imprisoned. She didn't understand why the Duke did it. Maybe it wasn't tasty, or maybe he doesn't like cheese. But meat goes perfectly with cheese. The girl asked the man who was locking the deadbolt whether he was there too. She asked him if he knew what had become of the leftover meat after she had been locked up here. The man was surprised that she would think of such nonsense in such a situation. The man was ready to answer since the girl had asked him. The leftover meat was destroyed by order of the Duke. The girl was stunned by the answer. She grabbed the metal bars of the cage with her hands. She understood everything now, why she had been taken out of sight. In any case, Luann's role ended with the fall of the kingdom. Of course, she expected her to die, and that would be the end of it. She remembered people shouting jerky. It was incomprehensible. She was captured and imprisoned because of a piece of meat. The girl pondered. She must have made the Duke very angry. Would he be able to keep his promise and kill her quickly? Or would he want to punish her because the taste of the meat was terrible? She remembered the happy moments of her childhood, when she sat in front of the window and looked carefree at the street. The green trees. They can just lock her up here in jail. She had spent her whole life in an abandoned yard, and now she would die in confinement. It wasn't fair. At that time, someone came to the door. The man turned to the girl and called her a witch. The girl looked up at the man in surprise. Her eyes were full of tears. The Duke himself stood before her. She was surprised. Perhaps she hadn't heard what he had called her. She asked him to repeat what the young man had just said. In her mind, a witch was an old woman with a long nose who brewed potions. The Duke wondered if she was still going to keep up the pretense. With cheese, the Duke finished. The girl looked directly into the young man's eyes. She still didn't understand what was wrong with that piece of meat and cheese, why they were calling her a witch now. The Duke bent towards the girl. Their eyes were on the same level. He said he could taste the flavor of dried meat and cheese. He confessed that because of a witch's curse that had been passed down in his family for generations, such days were gourmet meals. They were prepared by skillful cooks. But the Duke felt nothing but a nauseating aftertaste when consumed. The girl wondered if a witch's curse had been placed on the Duke. The girl understood everything. She grabbed the bars with her hands and asked the Duke to wait a little, not to leave so immediately, and let her speak. She thought he was here for her because it wasn't tasty. Turns out it was the opposite. The Duke tasted meat for the first time. Rather, because the meat turned out to be edible. The Duke walked over to the tool case. There were scissors, an axe, a hammer, and other metal implements. He picked up one of the metal devices. He said again that he had lost his sense of taste because of the witch's curse. The fact that he could taste the meat she cooked, and that was an amazing fact. That's why he figured the girl was most likely a witch. The girl was furious. The Duke's instrument gleamed in his hand. The girl was just throwing sparks. The Duke was saying something incomprehensible. What witch? She just made cheese jerky according to her favorite recipe. She liked to eat it very much herself. The girl thought for a moment. That's right, come to think of it, that's what the short story said. The Duke of Legion's ancestor was cursed by a witch. He too had lost his taste and experienced any food as something disgusting. Whatever cook had prepared it, whatever products were used, everything came out unpalatable and bland. The witches were gone, but Hertz continued to search for a way to break the curse. What a mess he'd made. He knocked over everything on the table and broke crockery, poured wine. His hatred is hard to put into words. It was something terrible. But the girl was just an extra. She asked me to wait. She was the princess of a fallen kingdom, and now they call her a witch. The girl screamed that she wasn't a witch. The Duke agreed with her. Of course she's not a witch. But soon she would tell the truth. The Duke looked fiercely at the girl. She stood against the wall and was angry. Why wouldn't anyone believe her? She was telling the truth. She planned to eat delicious food and die in peace. Torture didn't fit into her plans. The Duke came closer and closer. He held something like a pair of tongs in his hand. His hand was getting closer. No, it doesn't have to be like this. There had to be some way to avoid it, to stop the mad Duke. The girl looked at the young man with wide-open eyes. Tears were dripping from her eyes. At that moment, the girl realized. She fell to her knees in front of the Duke. She had no other choice. And the girl made a confession, even though it wasn't true. She admitted that, yes, she was a witch. She decided to just admit it. The Duke was surprised. He once again asked her to spell out what she said. The girl said that she was just learning to be a witch, so she couldn't cast a curse. So she asked the Duke to take a look at something. She pulled up the sleeves of her dress. There was some kind of mark on her arm. The girl said it was the mark of a witch, and she ran her hand over the red mark on her arm once more. To be honest, it was actually just a burn that the girl got while cooking. She touched the cauldron on the cooker, and her skin instantly turned red. There was a look of confusion in the Duke's eyes. It was exactly what the young man wanted to hear. The Duke realized that the girl had used sorcery to make jerky. That's why it was so delicious. The girl said that it was true. She had used a little sorcery. In fact, the girl didn't need witchcraft. She used beef raised in the pure meadows and fresh air of the kingdom. I also added a certain secret ingredient. The Duke wondered if she had really used some bugs for cooking as well. This time the young man was wrong. She didn't use beetles at all. Either way, she was telling the truth. The girl asked after she told the Duke the truth if he would torture her. The girl sat on the floor and looked straight into the Duke's eyes. Was he really that cruel? The Duke replied that he could taste it. He hadn't been able to taste for a very long time, and it was amazing. He could taste the flavor of the jerky prepared by this princess. It was very tasty. I really liked the flavor of the meat, and he looked sternly straight into the girl's eyes. The Duke said if she wasn't a witch yet, but had the necessary knowledge, he was willing to do without torture, and he gave the tongs to the young man who stood behind him. The girl breathed a sigh of relief. She was glad the Duke had made that decision. The Duke wanted to say something else, but he stopped talking, saying only one letter. One of the confinement doors was open. Most likely the princess had been released. Torches burned on the walls, illuminating the room. It was daytime outside. The kingdom glittered with gilded columns. The girl stood at the window and admired the view from the window. The window was the same as the door was barred, and the confinement no one could leave unnoticed. The girl thought she would never see that sky again. She was very happy about simple things. To be able to see the sky, to hear the birds singing, to see the leaves swaying in the breeze. It was so beautiful. At that moment, a young man came into the princess's room. He asked her when she would start cooking. The girl was ready to start cooking any minute. She said she was already running and headed for the kitchen. The girl took out the necessary groceries: pumpkin, Peking cabbage, a fresh and juicy piece of beef and mushrooms. It was too early for her to relax. After all, her life depended on the preparation of this dish. She must cook it to perfection. Her food must please the Duke. And the girl took the cabbage in her hands. Back in the dungeon, the Duke had said that she would need to have something ready for him when the sun rose. The girl didn't know what exactly the Duke liked, what his preferences were. He said that if he liked the dish she cooked, he would keep her alive. So making this dish was very important to the girl. Got my hands on some kale and thought for a second. To make something so exquisite and with incredible flavor. She looked back at the young man. The Duke put a lookout with the girl. He was to watch her work. The girl was surprised that these were the best ingredients she could dream of in an abandoned palace. Fresh vegetables and mushrooms. She hadn't seen one since her rebirth. Fresh beef, fish, spice salts, and here was everything she needed to prepare a gourmet meal. The girl tied the bow tighter on her apron. She decided she would just do it, and just make her favorite dish with those ingredients. After all, she had been cooking since she was a child and her taste was excellent. Even if it was the last meal she would ever prepare, she would make sure that the Duke would never forget her. And the girl picked up a broad knife for cutting vegetables. She quickly began chopping the vegetables into bars. She threw the vegetables into the cauldron where the liquid was boiling. After that, she started stirring the rice noodles. No corn was visible. The girl worked quickly and diligently, and the young man watched her every action. What products she added, what spices. The young man was also surprised. What an unusual combination of ingredients. The girl stirred the contents of the cauldron with a ladle. She poured a little into the ladle and poured it back into the cauldron, and triumphantly shouted out that everything was ready. The girl was happy to be doing her favorite task. Steam was rising from the cauldron. The dish could not be allowed to cool down. After all, then it would lose all its flavors. So the girl quickly put the lid on the dish. She placed the dish on a special table on rollers and took it to the Duke. The young man asked her to follow him. He was to accompany the girl straight to the Duke's room. They walked down a wide corridor. The young man walked a little ahead. Behind him walked the princess, who was carrying a table with food in front of her. The girl was walking and could smell that dish. The smell was amazing. The girl was upset that the Duke was about to eat right in front of her and she would only have to watch. She, too, would have loved to taste this dish. The young man and the princess approached the door. There were guards standing on either side of the door. The door opened and the girl started to walk into the room. There was blinding sunlight coming from the room. The Duke himself was sitting at the table in front of her. Behind him was a window with sunlight coming from it. The Duke had his back to the window. He quickly raised his head and looked at the girl. The girl looked straight into the Duke's eyes. She mentally asked him not to worry. The girl quickly reprimanded that the meal was served and brought the table over to the Duke's table. She grasped the lid with her hand to open it. Another second, and she lifted the lid. This dish she was 100% sure of. It was her favorite dish, one she cooked very often. It just couldn't be unpalatable. At that, the girl was very excited. A foaming aroma and white puffs of steam came from under the lid. The Duke sat at the table and did not take his eyes off the princess. He watched her every movement. The young woman looked carefully into the cauldron. What is this dish that smells so delicious? It was a whole culinary masterpiece. Nasha asked what the dish was called. The girl thought for a moment. The girl mentally pronounced that this dish was called millefeuille. It was a dish she really adored in her previous life. It all became clear to the Duke. He quickly took a knife in his right hand and a fork in his left. But she couldn't say that to the Duke. She closed her eyes and thought for a moment. Then she said it was her own personal improvisation. She suggested that the Duke try it quickly before it got cold. After all, this dish is most delicious when it's warm. He was surprised at the princess's self-confidence. He couldn't believe that the princess had dared to improvise because her life was at stake. The girl was a little upset. She wanted Herza to taste the dish as soon as possible, and then they would see how he would sing afterwards. It is impossible to remain indifferent to the combination of fresh meat, vegetables, and nut sauce. The girl suggested to dip the meat and vegetables in the sauce and only then to taste. The Duke wanted the girl to taste it first. It was just in case to make sure the food wasn't poisoned. The princess didn't need to be begged several times. She agreed and took the wooden instruments in her hand. She was surprised that the Duke thought she had added poison to it. The girl had never had her hand raised to do that to delicious food. She picked up the meat and vegetables with her chopsticks, then dipped them in a special nut sauce, and put it to her mouth. She opened her mouth and brought up the vegetables and meat. The smell was incredible. Tasted delicious. The girl from where the pleasure came from covered her eyes. She savored the taste of the dish. At this time, the Duke was watching the girl closely. He asked what she was holding. In her hands, she held 2 wooden sticks. She said they were wooden cutlery, and she added that Korean food is very uncomfortable to honor without chopsticks, so she and her nanny made them. Tears flowed from the girl's eyes at the memory of the nanny. The Duke thought for a moment. He could tell from the girl's confident actions that the food was not poisoned at all. The Duke said that the food might contain delayed action poison, so it was necessary to wait a little longer and watch the girl's reaction. If nothing happened to her in the meantime, the food could be eaten. At that second, the girl slammed her hands on the table. She shouted that she couldn't wait. If the food got cold, it would be completely unpalatable. In surprise, the Duke stepped back. The princess reiterated once more that she needed milphias immediately after cooking. Apparently because she's a witch, she's acting unusual. But somehow, it didn't seem like she was bluffing. The Duke poked the meat and vegetables on his fork. He dipped the meat and vegetables in the sauce. He put his fork to his mouth. The Duke put the food in his mouth and began to chew it thoroughly. He chewed long and leisurely. After that, a gulp of food. The princess stood holding her breath. What if he didn't like it? What if he didn't like this combination of ingredients? The Duke put his fork down on his plate. He asked what she had served him. His voice was somewhat angry. He sat silent at the table. Sweet vegetables with a moderate amount of broth, prime veal that melts on the tongue, and a nutty sauce that complements the flavor. It was incredibly delicious. The Duke picked up the utensils again. He had never tasted anything like it before. Only the Duke wanted to say that everything was delicious. The princess interrupted him impatiently and asked him if it was really delicious. She stood in front of the Duke and gazed intently into his eyes. The Duke stared silently into the girl's eyes. It wasn't that bad. The girl opened her mouth in surprise and stared wide-eyed. She was delighted, then the Duke had a very satisfied look. It will be delicious if you boil noodles in the leftover broth. Not the pasta kind, but thicker ones, a combination that tastes like a heavenly delight. The Duke jumped up from his seat. The girl was somewhat alarmed. The Duke jumped up and shouted ominously at the girl. Before sending him here, His Majesty promised him something. If he suddenly wants to take something from the conquered kingdom, he can ask for anything. Whatever he wished, His Majesty was ready to fulfill. He thought then that the little kingdom could not interest him in anything. The girl looked surprised and looked the Duke straight in the eye. He continued to narrate and walked close to the girl. Now the Duke had changed his mind. The girl was surprised. What did he mean by that? It's all so sudden. The Duke came even closer. The girl was a little embarrassed. At that moment she cringed. She expected the Duke to say something terrible. The young man didn't understand why the princess was acting like that. The girl asked in horror to wait. Her eyes were frightened. The Duke also looked at her in bewilderment. The girl mumbled. If he acted on his wishes, then what would happen to her? The Duke replied that he would lock her up until all administrative matters were resolved. After that, he would take her back to the Empire with him. The princess felt dizzy. She would risk her own life to serve him breakfast until her last breath. Ingrid became indignant. Since he could take one thing away, shouldn't it be the blonde, blue-eyed beauty? Then perhaps a languid, red-headed coquette would do. And the princess remembered another princess from the kingdom. The Duke replied that he had no such thought. The girl insisted that the Duke should think things over again. The Duke was indignant. Was the princess now trying to mate his judgment? And he bent even closer to her. The princess pulled back a little. They stood looking into each other's eyes. The Duke ordered the man to take her away, feed her, and lock her in the dungeon. The girl asked him to wait and not to jump to conclusions. She was standing in the kitchen again. Sunlight flooded the entire room. The Duke was sure this girl was his. The princess had a very bad headache. Here she is already putting a pan on the cooker. Slice the onion into half rings. Carrot slices, green pepper slices. I salted everything a little. Crack and pour in 1 egg. poured in all the previously cooked vegetables. The fire under the pan was high. The girl with certain movements tossed the vegetables up them. First things first, you need to improve your well-being, and the rest she decided to think about later. The girl was preparing a dish and hummed, "Be delicious, be delicious." This song she often sang in the kitchen when cooking a dish. The dish was already formed and laid on a beautiful plate. The girl was approached by a man who was always looking after her. He asked her what she was doing. The girl told him that if she cooked them like this, they would taste even better. The man looked at the princess in surprise. I wondered if she was casting some kind of spell. The girl was stunned. Could it be that he was the same way? Why was she surrounded by such naive people? The girl said, "You could say that too." She turned to the knight and asked if he would like to try her dish. The knight was surprised. She means him now. He looked carefully at the dish prepared by the princess. The knight held out his hand, took one piece in my hands, and began to sort of mold the ingredients together. He also repeated the saying, "Be delicious." This amused the girl. She asked if the knight had finished modeling and wanted to see what he had made. There was some kind of unevenly molded circle on the table. The girl rolled up her sleeves and motioned for the knight to observe how it was done. It is necessary to fry finely chopped vegetables and eggs. After that, mix the ingredients with the seasoned rice. After that, roll the mixture into balls. It is important to mold the balls into the same shape. And the girl showed the knight an evenly molded ball. It was the right shape and perfectly even. The knight was surprised. I asked her to try to mold the knight again, and she would see. The knight had very big hands, so he can make much bigger balls than the princess. The knight looked at the princess carefully. She was not such an evil witch, but rather kind, sympathetic, sweet, and cheerful. At this moment, the knight seemed to feel his lordship's gaze upon him. The duke seemed to be watching the knight's every movement. It was a strange sensation. A few minutes later, there was already a whole pile of formed balls on the plate. The girl thanked for her help in preparing the food, and she tasted one of the balls. It was indescribably delicious. The rice was cooked perfectly. The sweet vegetables combined with the salted rice tasted incredible. The girl insisted that Sir Knight should also try this dish. She was sure he would like it. The knight looked at the girl in surprise. After that, he shifted his gaze to the balloon he had molded himself. He picked it up and brought it to his mouth, but only he took a bite. His eyes widened. It was really good, spicy and cozy at the same time. I took small bites and savored it. The girl asked the knight to rest, passed the remaining marbles to the other knights to share with them, and the girl passed a paper-wrapped balloon into the knight's hands. The girl only gave the knight a few balls. He wondered if she was going to eat all the rest of the rice. The girl was signing the packages of rice. She wanted to share more with the nurse and eat a little herself. The knight held the package in his hand and looked at the girl in surprise. He didn't think it made sense. The girl didn't understand the knight's words. They came to a tall door. The girl was surprised that they separated the servants from the royal family. Well, could a girl stay with the princesses? After all, they'd be using her as a servant. Why did they equate her being locked up in an abandoned palace for the rest of her life with being a member of the royal family? It wasn't fair if she had to serve them as well. The girl asked the knight if she could not go. The knight said that it was impossible because it was impossible to ignore his lordship's order. And the girl with her head down went on. She gripped the door handles with her hands and opened them. Even if she survived her encounter with the Mad Duke, that didn't mean she wouldn't be made into a maid or a foot towel. So she asked God for help. It was getting dusk outside. The moon and hundreds of small stars were already visible in the sky. The lights were on in the kingdom. The knight walked down the corridor. In front of the rice balls, all the dignity of the royal family evaporated. The girl asked to join the queue. I was surprised. The royalty were chasing the rice balls like rabid dogs. The knight looked round and saw another knight. His name was Lugard. A young blonde-haired knight greeted the other knight. The young men approached each other, and they started a conversation. The blonde-haired youth asked what the knight was doing. He replied that his shift was over, and he wanted to rest for a while. The blonde-haired young man said he had just been released too, and he was just starving. The knight pulled out of his pocket the bundle the princess had given him. He said he could treat the knight to this one, and handed him a pouch with a bow and a funny face drawn on it. It was a rice ball cooked by the princess from the abandoned palace. The young man was surprised. The princess had made it herself, but the smell was amazing. At this time, the duke himself approached the men. The young man held the pouch in his hands and looked at the duke in surprise. They quickly leveled up and saluted your lordship. The Duke asked fiercely what he had just said. The knight repeated that he had treated his friend to a rice ball prepared by a princess from the abandoned palace. The Duke only hacked back. He thought for a moment, and this princess is very brave indeed. The royals had already practically had a fight with the rice balls. The princess's handbag, which she had brought rice balls with her, was lying on the floor. The princesses were arguing. One shouted that she was the first to take the balloon. The other shouted that she was the first to touch it. The princess from the abandoned castle sat crying. She didn't expect such a reaction to the rice balls. At that moment, someone called out to her. One of the princesses reached out to her. The princess held out her hand to the girl and asked her to sit next to her. After all, the floor was very cold and the girl could catch cold. The girl gave a quick thank you and sat down carefully next to her on the princess's bed. She held her breath. She sat there, afraid to even breathe. The princess realized that the protagonist was on a whole other level. She had eaten nothing in captivity and had not taken a bath for a long time, but she still looked noble and beautiful. The girl remembered something and reached under her apron pocket. She pulled one rice ball out of there. She managed to save the last ball. She wanted to keep it so she could have breakfast with it in the morning, and she smiled. She held out the balloon to the princess. The princess in her beautiful attire looked at the food carefully. Her eyes became crazed. The girl moved the balloon away from the princess a little, moving behind the rice ball and looking at it with crazy eyes. The girl had already raised the rice ball high above her head. The girl continued to stare frantically at the balloon. At this time, the SIS and SES realized everything and quickly averted her gaze. She apologized. After all, she didn't mean anything by it, and she wasn't hungry. So she suggested that the girl eat that rice ball and not be shy. The girl was surprised. While others are fighting over rice balls, I was the only girl who didn't move. Of course, the princess was hungry. But despite her doll-like appearance, she is still a human being who is no stranger to basic needs. After a little thought, the girl called Princess Ingrid again. The princess turned her head. The girl held out the rice ball to the princess. She asked her to eat the treat. Princess Ingrid became indignant. She couldn't just pick up a rice ball and eat it. It wasn't hers. But the girl insisted. She said she cooked them before she came here, so she had time to eat them. And the girl cook laughed out loud. Princess Ingrid looked at her in surprise. She didn't understand why she was laughing. The princess took the rice ball in her hand and said, and the princess quickly broke the rice ball in half. Princess Ingrid handed one of the halves to the girl. She said that half was enough for her. The girl was very surprised. Was Princess Ingrid really so noble? Princess Ingrid thanked the girl. She was very grateful that the girl had shared her dinner with her. These words struck the girl in the heart. She was beautiful not only externally, but also internally. The girl eating the rice ball thought for a while. That's why the emperor and the duke gave their hearts to her. The other two sisters were very surprised. Why was the duke being lenient with Princess Ingrid in particular? The girl kind of felt the duke's gaze on her, but she couldn't look around as she was eating a delicious rice ball. At that time, the girls saw the duke coming towards them. They heard his footsteps. The duke stood before the girls and looked at them intently. He said as sternly as ever to one of the girls. The girl didn't understand. What was wrong? What was wrong again? There was a napkin with an unfinished rice ball on the table. The sisters held hands as if to support each other. The duke's eyes were fierce. They seemed to burn red in color. The duke motioned for the girl to follow him. The girl was stunned. She thought he'd ordered her to come here. A thought never left the girl's head. If the duke orders, one must simply accept it. If he says go, then go. And don't ask unnecessary questions. The girl rose and bowed. At this time, Princess Ingrid extended her hand. She blocked the girl with her hand. She asked what kind of disrespect was this. She would not allow him to behave as he pleased and annoy her little sister. The duke was surprised to hear such words from the princess. He turned to ask again, pretending not to hear, what she was going to prevent him from doing. At that second, the duke ordered him to grab her. The knight took the command, headed towards his little sister. He grabbed the girl's arm hard. The little sister was in a lot of pain, and she cried out in pain. The girl fell to the floor. The duke specified that another princess was to be captured. The knight realized in command, headed for the other sissy. He also grabbed the girl's arm hard. The knight quickly led Princess Ingrid away from the room. The little sister sat on the floor and shouted to her sister. The duke looked round and said, and that no one else would dare to interfere. and he told the girl it was time to go out. The girl looked at the Duke in surprise, where she should go. The Duke specified that she should go to the kitchen. They came quickly into the kitchen. The girl was near the countertop. She asked the Duke what he wanted her to cook. Sitting on a chair with his leg up, I asked the girl to cook for his precious subordinates. The girl wondered if he meant rice balls. Yes, that's exactly what the Duke meant. He was very eager to try it. The girl was surprised. That's why the Duke burst into the room, daring to send her sister to the dungeon. Now he's brought her into the kitchen and wants her to cook rice balls for him in the middle of the night. The girl really wished she could say those words out loud, but she didn't dare. She just laughed. She was amused that she had to cook so late at night. The Duke clarified. Doesn't she want to cook this dish for him? And he looked at her ominously with his eyes. His gaze made her feel cold inside. She said not at all. He misunderstood. After all, she is simply an expert night cook. The Duke sat staring at the princess in surprise. The girl turned back to the tabletop and prepared to get to work. The Duke had said that from now on. She needed to make sure she was only cooking for him. The girl looked back at the Duke in surprise. At that second, the Duke leaned on the armrest and rose from his chair. He went to the girl. He reiterated that she should not cook for his subordinates or her sisters, but only for him. If he came close to the girl as if to pin her to the tabletop, he wasn't in the habit of sharing it with anyone. The girl looked at the Duke with wide-open eyes. His lips and eyes were very close to her face. She agreed, but the girl confessed that at that moment, her vegetables were burning on the cooker. The Duke realized that he was disturbing the whole cooking process, so he quickly moved away from the girl. He turned and walked away. Once again, he repeated that he just wanted her to understand what he wanted to tell her. The girl nodded approvingly. After the Duke came out, the girl clutched her heart. He really scared her. She didn't understand why she had to get so close to the person she was talking to. The preparation of the rice balls consisted of several steps. The girl had already fried all the vegetables and made spicy rice. All that's left is to pop the rice balls, and you can serve. The Duke was not far from the girl and watched her every move. He was probably very hungry, and now the moment had come. The Duke took the rice ball in his hand and brought it to his mouth. The girl looked intently at the Duke. She asked if he even chewed his food before swallowing it. She had the impression that the Duke swallowed without chewing at all. There were a few rice balls on the table in front of him, wrapped in a napkin. He said he was worried enough. The girl sat across from the Duke and watched him intently as he ate the rice balls. She said it was unrealistic to swallow at this speed, let alone worry. Duke flew rice balls one after another. He quickly brought the rice ball to his mouth, took a bite, and chewed. When the Duke had eaten the whole plate, he sighed in relief and stroked his stomach. At that moment, his stomach began to ache. It seemed that he had just eaten too much. The balls were so delicious that the Duke couldn't stop. The girl lowered her eyes to the floor. Who would have doubted it? Anyone would be full after a sixth serving this late in the day. He didn't even offer the girl a taste of one of them. The Duke motioned for the girl to go back. The girl didn't need to be told twice. She quickly made her way to her room. She waved goodbye to the Duke. But the Duke was against it. He said a firm no. The girl looked at him carefully. He said she would go to the room where he was staying. The girl looked at him in surprise. She asked him once more all the rooms she had to go now. Herzog repeated irritably, didn't she hear? He said she should go to his room. The girl laughed merrily. Of course it was necessary to go to the Duke's room. She laughed first. Then she realized what she was talking about and wondered. Then she had to go to the Duke's room. Replied that it didn't look like she was capable of escaping on her own. The Duke preferred to look after her personally. Therefore, she must go with the Duke to his room. The girl was surprised. How could she dare to run away? She followed the Duke and pondered. If this is the Duke's quarters, it doesn't mean he has one room and one bed. There are most likely other rooms there. That's what she thought to herself and reassured herself along the way. We approached the Duke's room. The girl clutched her hands to her face. Was he really going to behave like this? If she had known this before, she would have preferred to serve princesses all night long. They walked into the room. It was only one room. The Duke began to take off his clothes. The girl was sitting on the sofa with her back turned. He was a duke, after all. How could he use just one bedroom? The girl stood pondering. At that moment, the young man began to unbutton his shirt. He had already undone several buttons on the top of his shirt. He opened his shirt, revealing his young, pumped-up body. The girl only exclaimed in surprise. At that moment, too, the Duke turned round and looked at her. She asked me to forgive her. She decided to look the other way. She was just very surprised when he took off his shirt and exposed his body. The girl's face was flaming. She was embarrassed. She kept repeating to herself that he should have sent her to the princess room. The Duke continued to undress. The girl at this time was sitting on the chair with her back to the Duke. She tried not to look, but she was very curious. After all, the Duke was young and handsome. So she sat back, but from time to time she turned round and looked at his handsome body. The Duke took the shirt completely off of himself. The girl noticed that he was very skinny. His hands were very thin. When he was wearing clothes, it didn't show at all. He also had a very skinny and long neck. Noticed the girl watching him. He turned quickly towards her. The girl turned away quickly at the same time. She couldn't figure out what he usually ate since he was so thin. Could he really taste the food she had just cooked? The girl pondered this thought. The Duke asked her what she was thinking about, and she didn't say a word. After a second, she asked if he was dressed and if she could turn to him. Tuck replied that yes, he was already dressed. It was so amazing to see the Duke in his pajamas and indoor slippers. Without his uniform, he wasn't so ugly. A handsome man is always handsome. At this time, the Duke took up his sword. The girl decided to take it back. After all, he's scary in any form. But the Duke leaned back on his pillow, hugged his sword, and closed his eyes. The girl wondered if he was going to sleep like that. She supposed it was very uncomfortable. He replied that he sleeps very badly at night anyway. His sleep is very sensitive because of the curse. The girl once again wanted to clarify about the curse. He can't taste food at all. I can't believe it's possible. It just didn't make sense to her. The Duke was surprised. Was the witch asking him about the curse? It was beyond him that he could not answer that question. He gripped his sword tighter, and he thought for a second. He said he could taste it. The girl asked again. He could taste it, but whatever he was eating cherry apples, it was all like sand. And the soup reminded me of the taste of sewage. But he ate what she cooks, and I can taste it. He is able to taste what she has cooked. That explains a lot. That's why he ate so many rice balls. Because he doesn't usually eat properly. That's why he's so thin. The Duke was indignant. Why was the princess asking him such questions as well? With curse him too while he sleeps. The girl said not at all, she was just very curious. The girl had her questions answered, so she decided to lie down first. She quickly lay down on the couch and covered herself with a blanket. The Duke hugged his sword and watched the girl closely. Night came. There was a full moon. The moon took on the distinct shape of a circle. The girl was lying on the bed, but she was completely awake. She watched through her eyelashes the moonlight that shone through the window. The room was very, very quiet. When the royal palace was captured, people were executed or taken into custody. The girl at that moment thought it had come to an end. Her throat was not cut. Somehow she even managed to eat. And now she is not lying on a cold dungeon, but in a soft, warm bed, even if it is just a sofa. But she's not saying she's lucky. The Duke's words in her head, "You, follow me, cook, sleep in his room." All because the Duke had behaved unexpectedly. But there was one but. What if? The girl thought for a moment. So she's the only one who can cook a good meal for his lordship. Perhaps she shouldn't give up now that things have turned out this way. If only she could. The girl lay back and pondered. She had the whole night to think about it. If you think about it that way, what happened to Ingrid and the nanny? And she remembered the episode when she ran to her nanny and was unspeakably happy. She threw herself around the nanny's neck, asking where she'd been. The nanny looked at the princess unsurprised. The girl tells me that she had a very scary dream. An evil Duke calls her a witch and made her cook. But at that moment, the girl woke up. The nanny was in agreement with the girl. The dream was really kind of weird. The princess was crying. She was very glad that it was only a dream. She was very frightened. At that moment, the girl wondered. Why was her nanny such a hard to the touch? She was actually groping the Duke with her hands. It was all in a dream, and the girl didn't know what to do. At this time, she opened her eyes. In front of her lay the Duke. He asked her if she was really awake. She lay in the Duke's arms, calling her a witch again. There was no other way to explain her actions. The Duke was surprised. The princess was very brave. After she said she wasn't going to do anything, she crawled into his bed. The Duke didn't expect such a turn of events. She grabbed him tightly, immobilizing him with her hands on his chest. The girl was horrified. Why the Duke had tolerated this? Why he hadn't thrown her off? The Duke smiled sweetly. He said he was a knight, and how could he throw off a lady? The girl realized the Duke was lying. After all, he was going to torture her before. The Duke reached a hand for his sword. He was sure she was ready for the consequences of her recklessness. The girl sat there not realizing what was going to happen to her now. She got down on her knees and began to beg. She was so sorry. She asked the Duke what she could do to make him forgive her for this act. Getzog wondered if he had to think about that too. The princess quickly decided that she would take care of it herself. At this time, the Duke slipped his sword into its scabbard. He said okay and added that he was very hungry. The girl pushed herself off the Duke's bed. She hurried to the kitchen on the flight. She said she'd have it ready right away. It was insane. Crazy, just a nightmare. And the girl threw the piece of veal on the chopping board. I didn't care at all about what was going on. It was not necessary to show bad habits in this position, and the girl started slicing the meat with quick movements. If the Duke hadn't made her sleep in the same room as him, this wouldn't have happened at all. She pondered and quickly sliced the meat. She asked herself to pull herself together and called herself a wimp. It was as if she could see the Duke's sword, and his instructions that everything must be prepared properly. The girl was crumbling so fast that one careless movement and she might be left without a finger. After slicing the veal and pork, it is necessary to mix milk with slices of bread. After that, add the necessary spices. Add tomato paste, chopped onions, and cheese to enhance the flavor. Mix everything well and put it all into the bread mold. Bake in the oven until cooked through. While we are waiting for it to cook, we need to prepare the potato salad with vegetables. Everything was almost ready, but something else was needed. And the girl remembered her speciality, onion soup. At this time, a knight peeked through the door and inquired about cooking. The girl came back and said that the soup still needed to simmer a little longer. The knight said they had a little problem, because the knight had already started polishing his sword, and if he started to do that, it would do someone no good. And the girl promised to get on the bed table right away. The girl decided that she would just take the soup off the menu, if the Duke had to wait longer. The girl quickly put everything on the table and rolled towards the Duke's room. If she procrastinates and finishes the soup, she's going to freak out. The girl was already standing with the table in front of the Duke's room. The doors opened and blinding sunlight burst out. The Duke was already ready and beautifully dressed. The girl marveled at the Duke's appearance. The girl quickly rolled the table up to him. She began to tell me who she had cooked this time. It was called meatloaf, and she quickly set the table. Duke can eat meatloaf with potato salad. It's the perfect combination. The Duke asked for another plate. The girl quickly served the Duke another plate. He took the plate in his hand and motioned for the girl to sit down. The girl, as usual, interjected, pretending not to hear. It made him angry. She dared to ignore his orders. The girl said she was getting in. The Duke poked the meatloaf on his fork. Luann sat very far away from the Duke. She was surprised by the table setting. The girl thought she was going to have to check the food again, just like last time. But why would she do that when the Duke was eating meatloaf with both cheeks? The young man asked if the girl wasn't going to eat. The princess quickly said that she had already eaten. She didn't know what the Duke was thinking, but she obediently complied with his requests. Even if she decides tomorrow to take her head from the hands of the man sitting across from her. The girl decided to savor every bite she ate with all her heart, so she quickly poked the meatloaf on her fork. She brought the fork and roll to her mouth. She inhaled the flavor first. And then I tasted it. It was very tasty. The texture of the roll was soft like bread. The juice was just spilling out of my mouth, and the flavor of the tomato sauce combined with the meat. It was just delightful. After the princess had thoroughly enjoyed the meat, she decided to eat another spoonful of salad. It was so refreshing and softened the flavor. After sampling, the princess decided that both dishes were excellent, but she was more concerned about the Duke's opinion, whether he liked it or not. The girl looked at the Duke's plate. It was empty. The tray on which the meatloaf lay was also empty. The girl wondered, when did he have time to finish it all? After all, she had made 5 portions, so that should have been enough food for a long time. The Duke finished gorging himself on the food while the girl chewed on a spoonful of salad. The girl wondered if he hadn't cracked up from all the food he'd eaten. She asked if he liked the food. The Duke replied that it was worth a try and wiped around his mouth with a napkin. The princess was happy, for the Duke liked the food she had prepared for him. The Duke said that if he cut off her brush, she wouldn't be able to cook so deliciously anymore. So I had to forget about the incident that night. The girl thanked the Duke. She was unspeakably glad that she had survived. The Duke once more looked at the girl straight in the eyes. The girl leaned over at this point. The Duke looked at the girl. The girl stood with her head tilted. At this time, the Duke snapped his fingers. He said there is another issue that needs to be sorted out. At this time, the maid's hands reached out to the girl. They grabbed her arms and held her down. The princess didn't realize what was happening. She apologized to the Duke once more for what had happened during the night. He looked intently at the girl. After that, he turned away. Once again, he began to look the girl contemptuously straight in the eye. After all, as long as he ate her food, he looked quite content. After that, the command was given to take the princess away. The maids quickly grabbed the girl under her arms and led her away. The princess asked for a moment. She wanted to say something to the Duke. The doors in the room were already closed. The princess was a little embarrassed, for the maids brought her to the bath and began to bathe her, and the princess liked it very much, as she had not taken a bath for a long time and began to smell bad. The girl asked if she was going to be interrogated after the bath. The maids apologized to her. One of the girls said maybe she had misunderstood something, but the Duke ordered only that Miss Luann be washed and dressed. The second girl confirmed it, that it's true. Even a Duke would never hurt someone he spent the night with. The girl was surprised. Everyone around her was sure she had spent the night with the Duke. The girl blurted out that it was a misunderstanding. The girl decided to take care of the princess's nails. She was ready to do a neat manicure. Luann was surprised. Why no one listened to her? Here she was already washed up. The girls did her hair, wore beautiful earrings. They wove fresh flowers in her hair. Her old dress had been replaced with a lavish outfit, which sparkled with gems. She was very transformed. She looked like a real princess now. A bolero covered her shoulders. On her waist was a belt with gold jewelry. The Duke, seeing the girl, was fascinated. Now she looked much better than before. Before that, she looked like just a ragamuffin, only washing her hands. The girl was surprised how one could look at a person just because they were unwashed. But the princess decided not to go into details and forget about the reason for the stares. She was more confident now. She looked in the mirror and couldn't get enough of it. She had never had such beautiful outfits before. In the abandoned palace, her clothes were hardly better than those of the maids. If things had already worked out this way, she just had to thank the Duke. And the girl turned her head towards the Duke. The Duke looked at the girl. He came even closer to her and asked what she wanted to tell him. The girl froze at the look and forgot about everything. She just wanted to say thank you. The Duke gently stroked her cheek. He stroked her face once more. She was very pretty. Above the girl's head, the Duke caught a leaf. At this time, a knight approached them. He addressed His Majesty the Duke. The knight said something to the princess who was in the dungeon, asking very much to meet him. If they were talking about the dungeon princess, Ingrid was the one they meant, how she survived the night in the dungeon. The Duke approached the dungeon. He had not come to the dungeon by himself, but had taken Luana with him. The girl was not sure why he had brought her here. She had no desire to be here again. The Duke asked Ingrid a question. He had heard that the princess wished to see him. Ingrid asked what his intentions were. The Duke was amused. Is she really interested in his intentions? She wants to know what he's trying to accomplish during her time here. The Duke imprisoned the girl and never showed up, so he just wanted to isolate her so he could put the squeeze on her in the future. Ingrid didn't know what the Duke was up to, but some dungeon was utterly incapable of breaking her will. The Duke told the girl to keep holding on to that will. She became desperate. She questioned once more what the Duke had said. Had Ingrid told him everything, and if so, he wasn't going to just waste his precious time. The Duke said to confess to the guards next time, and he was not distracted on such matters. The young man turned round and walked away. Ingrid clutched her dress with her hand. She saw her sister Luann standing next to the Duke, and the girl called out to her. She asked if her little sister was all right, if the Duke was hurting her, and if he'd done anything wrong to her. The girl was surprised. Even in the dungeon, Princess Ingrid continues to think of others. Luann said she was fine. More than that, and she had something else to say to her sister. But then came the fierce voice of the Duke. He asked what the princess was doing and ordered her to follow him. The girl sighed and quickly ran after the Duke. She apologized to her sister and asked her to take care of herself. Ingrid shouted Luana's name once more. How could she, sitting in a dungeon, take care of herself? The Duke thundered sternly again. Most likely she had forgotten. She has no right to act as she pleases. The girl understood and quickly apologized to the man. Duke handed her the lantern, and they walked quickly up the stairs. Luann turned around once more and looked at her sister. The stairs were very steep. The girl must be up to something. She asked if the Duke fed the royal family after he took custody. Liz said he was going to kill everyone anyway. Does it make sense to transfer money and time for food? That was said very cruelly. Is the Duke going to starve the royal family to death? Isn't there an option for them to stay alive? The Duke replied that members of the royal family did not deserve it. The Duke was surprised. The girl was talking a lot. She kept asking him some questions. He did not understand what was happening to her. The girl asked if he was hungry. It's dawn. The girl was sitting there humming some song. She kept saying the dish was delicious. Incredibly delicious. One of the knights heard the story. He didn't understand why it was so dark in the kitchen. It had long since dawned outside. The girl sat and pondered what was the most delicious thing she could make with the food available. Just tasty food was not enough. She should take this chance. Princess Luana had incredibly beautiful eyes. They were sky blue in color. The girl approached the Duke and asked if he was hungry. The Duke replied that it was approaching dinner time and he was getting a little hungry. But why did the girl ask that? Wasn't she obligated to cook the food when the time came? Right, well, for some reason it was infuriating. The thing was, and the girl clutched the lantern tightly. If the dish prepared is delicious, it is obliged to feed the royal family and servants. The girl asked the Duke to do it for her. The Duke was visibly surprised. The girl covered her mouth with her hand. She must have been in a hurry. She could have made the Duke angry with those words. She shouldn't have made terms with the Duke. Now he would most likely return her to the dungeon, just as he had her sister. And the girl closed her eyes. The Duke only asked why. The girl could not believe her ears. Had such a majestic Duke asked the reason for her proposal? He said before, they are the royal family of the captured kingdom, which means that many of them, if not all of them, will be executed. They will either be beheaded or starve to death. It's inevitable. So why transfer food for nothing? The Duke had heard that the royal family called the princess an abandoned princess. These people didn't even recognize her. Even so, the girl tried her best to help them. The Duke interrogated if he had understood everything correctly. The princess told me that she grew up as a neglected child in an abandoned palace. She had never seen her sisters or even her father's face before. But it doesn't matter who it is. It's her family or ordinary people. It makes you very sad to think that someone around you is starving. The Duke was surprised. The girl told the Duke the motto of her life. If she dies tomorrow, she must have a good meal beforehand. It sounded almost like a prayer. She didn't ask to feed them delicacies at all. It was enough if the food was simply edible. That would be enough, and it wouldn't be too costly. The Duke understood everything. He said quite a bit of idle chatter, and strangely enough accepted the princess's terms. The girl became happy. She thanked the Duke heartily. But the Duke added, only if he spoke the word delicious with his own lips. She was in agreement. It had all been decided. The girl had not expected such a reaction from the Duke, and the girl quickly set about cooking. If she cooks this, she's 100% sure that even the ugly Duke will appreciate it. On her table, she had a chicken carcass, potatoes, carrots, garlic, and various spices. To start, the chicken needed to be cut into portioned pieces. Marinate in milk to prevent sticking and get rid of odors. Add salt and pepper. Also table wine, garlic, and chili peppers. All of this needed to be filled with dough, and it was done. Now for the most important thing. High-temperature frying oil. In this century, butter is too expensive to use in large quantities. The girl was just lucky that she was currently in the royal kitchen, and so she could take as much food as she needed. The most important thing is that the dish must be tasty. This is the main condition. It was necessary to fry the pieces until crispy. The girl quickly dipped pieces of chicken in the batter and put them into the heated pan. At this time, the Duke was counting some letter. He reflected that the purge here was almost over, and soon he would be able to return to the Empire. When the time comes, you must choose the prisoners to go with him. If the food is good, then feed the royal family and the servants. The girl was just wondering if he could give food to the royal family. If you think about it that way, the Duke didn't quite approve of what he had done. Why had he ever agreed to such a brazen demand in the first place? If someone else had been in the princess's place, the Duke would have ripped out his impertinent tongue long ago. Even if this princess's mouse squeak was amusing, you can't go along with it. But everything had already been done, and there was no going back. It was only about the food. He was so desperate for her that now the witch was easily using that excuse as a trump card. It was just a cheap ploy, after which you don't need to serve him any more tasty food. Duke was called out by someone. The Duke gave permission to go. On the doorstep stood the princess, her dinner on the table. The girl cheerfully told me what was on their menu today. It was deep-fried chicken, potatoes, and beer. In short, chimayek, a syllabic abbreviation where chin means chicken and mayjok means beer. There were also fresh vegetables as an accompaniment. Once again he asked again, "Is it really the served dishes called chimayok?" The girl laughed merrily and confirmed, "Chicken goes well with beer." After the chicken was marinated, the princess fried it twice in oil until crispy. The double frying promotes evaporation, which makes the chicken even crispier. The girl was wearing the same clothes, only the clothes were soiled. She had done a good job. Duke said she didn't drink beer, probably just buy some wine. The girl asked him to taste it exactly as she served it, and to eat it quickly before it got cold. I understood everything and asked them not to talk anymore. He took the knife in his right hand and the fork in his left. He put a piece of chicken on a plate and cut it. Quickly, she sent a piece into her mouth. The girl looked at the Duke without taking her eyes off him. After all, the first reaction was the most accurate. The Duke began to slowly get worried. After that, his hand reached for his beer glass. The girl smiled imperceptibly. He sat in silence and said nothing. The girl wondered why he was eating and keeping silent. After the Duke tasted the beer, he was kind of transported to the bread field.